Welcome to Tochi Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The sun cast golden streaks through the marbled windows of the Okonkwo mansion, where Amarachi moved about in a flowing cream silk wrapper, her hands resting gently on her barely visible baby bump. The mansion, nestled in a highbrow estate in Lekki, was the kind of house people slowed down to admire. High gates, polished floors, glass balconies. Yet despite the luxury, Amarachi was humble, kind, and widely loved by her husband's staff. She was known for sharing food with the gatekeeper's children and personally delivering thank you cards to her husband's clients. On this particular morning, Amarachi had made her husband's favorite breakfast, yam porridge with goat meat, humming softly as she prepared to reveal her pregnancy. Her joy was fragile, almost sacred. She had waited 4 years for this moment, praying silently through every miscarriage, enduring societal whispers and her mother-in-law's sharp tongue. Now finally she carried life. Ngozi, her best friend of over a decade, watched Amarachi's joy with a practiced smile. Behind her perfectly shaped brows and designer jumpsuit was a festering bitterness, a silent war she had fought for years. She envied Amarachi's grace, her beauty, her marriage to Damien, the billionaire who never so much as glanced at another woman. Ngozi had tried to seduce him once in his office with a feigned wardrobe malfunction, and his rejection still stung. Amarachi, ever trusting, had laughed when she caught Ngozi too close to her husband. "My dear, leave Damien. You know he's stiff, like a church usher. He'll never cheat." And yet that very confidence added fuel to Ngozi's envy. She felt invisible beside Amarachi, second best in every room they entered. And now, Amarachi was pregnant? The final straw snapped in her heart as she smiled and reached to touch Amarachi's belly. "Wow, my friend. God has remembered you. I'm so happy for you," she said, while already plotting her downfall. Later that day, Amarachi and Ngozi went together to a local orphanage, as they often did, accompanied by the chief security officer's young son, Junior, a lively 8-year-old who clung to Amarachi like a second mother. As they played with the children, Amarachi gifted Junior a new toy car and promised to bake him banana bread next week. That evening, as Damien returned from work, Amarachi greeted him with a soft kiss on the cheek and said, "Baby, I have a surprise." But before she could speak, he was called away to an urgent meeting. She waved it off, deciding to wait for a more perfect moment. In the shadows of the garden, Ngozi stood with a bottle of wine, smiling to herself. Amarachi had just given her the perfect ammunition, a beloved child, a trusting friend, and a secret pregnancy. It was only a matter of time. 3 days later, the neighborhood woke up to sirens and shattered peace. News spread like wildfire. Junior, the beloved son of the estate's chief security officer, was found lifeless in a bush behind the children's park. His toy car, the same one Amarachi gifted him, was found clenched in his tiny hand. His bloodied uniform and a piece of pink scarf fabric led investigators straight to the last known adult he was seen with, Amarachi Okonkwo. It didn't take long for the rumors to morph into certainty. "She never had a child of her own," one whispered. "Maybe she was jealous," said another. The media, hungry for drama, descended like vultures. Headlines screamed, "Billionaire's wife implicated in child's murder," and social media began to circulate a doctored video clip that showed Amarachi arguing with the boy days before. It was fake, but convincing. Ngozi moved fast. She visited the police station, shedding tears, pretending to defend Amarachi, but subtly casting doubts. "I love her like a sister," she said tearfully. "But Amarachi has not been herself lately. She's been depressed, isolated. I even feared she might hurt herself. Maybe she snapped." At the same time, she discreetly handed over a toy smeared with the boy's blood to the police, saying she found it under Amarachi's car seat. It was a masterfully planted piece of evidence, taken the day before when Amarachi had left her car keys at home. Damien, in disbelief, called his lawyers. But when the police found Amarachi's scarf near the crime scene and matched the blood on the toy to the boys, he snapped. He locked himself in his study, shattered a glass, and refused to speak to her. Amarachi, horrified, insisted she had nothing to do with it, crying, begging, clutching her belly. But Damien's face was like stone. The chief security officer, mad with grief, demanded justice. The estate committee suspended Damien from their board, and investors began to pull out. Overnight, Amarachi went from beloved wife to vilified monster. She tried to reach Junior's mother to plead, but the woman spat in her face. Ngozi moved into the house to comfort Damien, and to everyone else, it looked like she was a loyal friend stepping in during a storm. Behind closed doors, however, she had already started sleeping in Amarachi's bed. 1 week later, Amarachi was formally charged with child murder and evidence tampering. The press mobbed her in court, and Ngozi was there again, weeping in the front row. Amarachi's face was sunken with disbelief. Her husband wouldn't look at her. Her best friend clutched his hand. And inside her, her baby kicked, the only soul that still believed she was innocent. The morning of her sentencing, Amarachi stood in the courtroom in a loose beige prison robe, handcuffed and barefoot, her hair matted from weeks without care. Her pregnancy was now slightly visible under the thin fabric. Reporters filled the benches, cameras flashing like thunder. The judge read out her crimes: murder of a minor, tampering with evidence, and obstruction of justice. Her lawyer, a timid man assigned by the court, had nothing substantial to defend her with. Every piece of evidence pointed to her. Every character witness had been bribed or silenced. Damien sat at the back, surrounded by guards, his face unreadable. Ngozi held his hand like a grieving widow. Amarachi's lips trembled as she scanned the room, her eyes pausing briefly on Damien's. She whispered, "Please believe me." But he turned his gaze away. The judge delivered the final blow. "This court sentences you, Amarachi Okonkwo, to death by hanging, effective after childbirth as per constitutional allowance for pregnant convicts." A gasp echoed through the room. Amarachi's knees buckled. She collapsed to the floor, cradling her belly, screaming, "I didn't do it. I swear. I didn't kill Junior." But her words were drowned by security dragging her up. Damien remained seated, his jaw clenched, his eyes misted. Ngozi covered her mouth in mock shock, hiding her victorious smirk behind a handkerchief. Outside the court, the media roared. "Billionaire's wife sentenced to death for child murder," read the headlines. And so, just like that, the woman who once had everything was driven away in a prison van, her wrist bound, her name destroyed, and the child inside her the only witness to her innocence. Back home, Ngozi moved into the master bedroom. She wore Amarachi's slippers, bathed in her perfume, and used her old lipsticks. Damien, broken and silent, let her take over everything. "We'll get through this," Ngozi whispered one night, resting her head on his chest. "You don't deserve to suffer for a woman who ruined your name." In the darkness, Damien didn't respond. Somewhere far away, in a prison cell, Amarachi curled up on a thin mattress, weeping into her arms. No family, no friends, no husband, just her unborn child. She swore silently that if God gave her one chance, just one, she would rise again. But that promise was sealed in silence, buried under concrete bars and the loud lies of a woman she once called her sister. The weeks that followed the sentencing blurred into a cold fog of pain, exhaustion, and quiet despair for Amarachi. The prison walls were painted in dull gray, and the air was thick with the stench of damp sweat and regret. Amarachi was placed in the high-security wing for violent offenders, surrounded by women who had long forgotten what mercy felt like. Her cellmate, a tough ex-gang leader named Maman-Kechi, initially scoffed at Amarachi's soft hands and her quiet tears at night. But soon, even Maman-Kechi began to watch her with strange respect, because Amarachi did not scream, she did not curse. She just endured. The guards mocked her privately. "Na billionaire wife be this? No even fit beg for pad," one of them sneered. And truly, Amarachi never begged. She wrapped her dignity around herself like a threadbare blanket, even as she scrubbed prison toilets with trembling hands and washed her clothes in muddy basins. Outside the prison walls, her name was now a punchline. Blogs, newspapers, and social media platforms sensationalized every detail of her case. Rich killer pregnant behind bars. One headline read. Another screamed, Damien's betrayed heart, the inside story. Ngozi, now popularly dubbed the loyal friend who stayed, gave interviews from the comfort of Amarachi's old living room. She wept crocodile tears in front of cameras, describing how she watched Amarachi spiral into depression, and how she begged Damien to stay strong for the sake of their shared community. People praised her for stepping in. In truth, Ngozi had replaced every photo of Amarachi in the mansion. Even the staff had been changed. Everyone loyal to Amarachi was quietly fired. Damien, though still emotionally distant, was slowly folding under Ngozi's control. He drank more now, smiled less, but still refused to talk about Amarachi. In prison, Amarachi's belly grew. The medical officer, a stern, unsympathetic woman named Nurse Iridi, visited her twice a month for checks. Amarachi rarely spoke, but each time she was asked to describe how she felt, she only whispered, "He kicks." The prison chaplain, an elderly man with milky eyes and a fading Bible, would visit her sometimes and pray. "You are not forgotten, my daughter," he would say. Amarachi would nod slowly, holding back tears. Each day she counted down, not to her death, but to her child's birth. It was all she had left. In the silence of her cell, she would press her hands to her stomach and sing softly, "Chisholm, God is with you. Even if I don't see you, you will rise." She began to write letters to her unborn child, but she had no paper. So she memorized every word, writing them in her heart. Love was now something she could only imagine in whispers. It was a rainy Wednesday night when Amarachi went into labor. There was no luxury suite, no comforting hand to hold, no husband pacing outside the room. Just darkness, dripping pipes, and the stench of unwashed bodies. She screamed once, loud enough for a guard to come running. "Shide Pusho!" Mama Nkechi shouted. Amarachi was dragged to the prison clinic, barely conscious. She bled heavily, too much, the nurse said. But through the pain and sweat, she refused to close her eyes. Her baby's heartbeat echoed in her mind like a drum of resistance. The delivery was long, messy, and brutal. But finally, the baby's cries pierced the room, sharp, loud, defiant. It was a girl. Amarachi sobbed silently, arms stretched, begging to see her daughter. But the nurse held the child just out of reach. Due to Nigerian prison regulations for inmates on death row, especially those accused of violent crimes, Amarachi's baby was seized by the government's child protection services within hours. A form was stamped. A signature was forged. The nurse never even told Amarachi where the child would be taken. "It's better you forget her," she said coldly. "You know, go live long anyway." Amarachi begged, screamed, crawled on her knees. But it was too late. All she knew was that her daughter had strong lungs and a cry that sounded like fire. She whispered the name into the shadows, Chisholm. Her gift, her faith, her God. That night, she was returned to her cell with empty arms and blood-soaked clothes. The other inmates gave her space. Even the toughest of them could not mock her. Amarachi sat in silence, staring at the corner of the room, where a shadow shaped like a cradle lingered for hours. Meanwhile, a nurse, the only sympathetic soul, scribbled the name Chisholm on the edge of the baby's clinic card before the child was moved to the orphanage system. She didn't know why, but something about Amarachi's quiet strength unsettled her. The baby was handed over to a woman from the Ministry of Child Welfare. No known relatives. No visitors. Mother on death row, she read aloud. The child was processed, tagged, and renamed in the system. Amarachi's name was erased, marked as classified, convicted murderer. Somewhere in Lagos, the baby began her life in a crowded orphanage, rocking slowly in a wooden crib that creaked with each breath. Back in prison, Amarachi no longer cried. She no longer slept. She simply stared into the wall each night, whispering the name of a daughter she never held, but whose heartbeat she still felt within her own chest. 5 years crawled by like centuries. Amarachi remained in prison, her death sentence quietly commuted to life after a change in national policy. She never received visitors. Damien never wrote. Her father, once a powerful business mogul, had died from the shock of her conviction. Her mother refused to ever speak of her. Amarachi became invisible, even to the guards. But within the walls of the prison, she found a rhythm. She scrubbed floors, taught younger inmates how to read. She prayed at dawn and dusk. Her voice never rose, but her presence was felt. Even Mama Nkechi, once hardened and harsh, now sat with her to share stories. "You're not like the rest of us," Mama Nkechi muttered once. "You don't even hate them." Amarachi simply looked up at the cracked ceiling. "What's the point of hating ghosts?" she replied. Inside her a quiet storm brewed, but she buried it deep. The only thing she held onto was the memory of Chisholm's cry. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined a little girl in yellow slippers running through the rain. Sometimes she'd wake from sleep screaming her name, Chisholm. Other nights, she pressed her hand to her chest, whispering, "Find me." It wasn't madness, it was survival. Meanwhile, Ngozi flourished. She and Damien were now the face of elite philanthropy. They posed for magazine covers and hosted healing seminars for grieving families. Ngozi, always childless, wore her infertility like a badge of dignity. People praised her strength. They called her the woman who healed a broken man. Damien, now aged and cold, rarely smiled. And though he never said it, Amarachi's absence haunted him like a ghost with no face. In the 7th year, Amarachi was called to the warden's office. "You're being released," he said flatly. "Behavioral exception. You qualify for external parole with tracking." Amarachi blinked, unsure if she heard right. "You'll report monthly to the assigned officer. But you're free." That word, free, felt foreign in her mouth. She signed the paper, collected her tattered clothes, and walked out of the prison gates. There was no one waiting. No child running into her arms. No husband. No friend. Just the gray clouds and Lagos rain. She stepped into the muddy street, alone, weak, and invisible. The guards closed the gate behind her without a glance. Amarachi looked up at the sky, opened her arms slightly, and let the rain wash over her like baptism. She whispered one word under her breath as her feet dragged through the puddles. "Chisholm." While Amarachi drifted through Lagos in silence, a different kind of silence had taken root inside the Okonkwo mansion, a colder one. The house still glittered on the outside with its trimmed hedges, imported tiles, and satin drapes, but inside, Damien Okonkwo moved like a ghost. It had been 7 years since Amarachi's sentencing, and the world had accepted Ngozi as his wife, even though there was no formal wedding, no vows, no announcement. It was a silent replacement. Damien had changed. The once sharp, assertive man now sat through meetings without speaking. His company, once the fastest-growing real estate empire in Lagos, now ran on the strength of board members and external consultants. Damien stayed locked in his study for hours, often staring at the framed article of Amarachi's conviction, not out of hatred, but confusion. Something in his gut never quite settled. But every time the doubt rose, Ngozi was there to smother it with her warm hands and soft lies. Ngozi had transformed herself from the envious friend to the adored philanthropist. With Amarachi gone, she wore new confidence like perfume. She launched an NGO in her name, the Amarachi Grace Foundation, claiming it was inspired by her late friend's final wish to support widows and children. She gave tearful speeches about pain, betrayal, and forgiveness, never once revealing she was the one who destroyed the very woman she now honored. Her face was on the cover of elite magazines. She was invited to government galas and whispered into powerful ears. Yet behind closed doors, she remained as bitter and paranoid as ever. Damien refused to give her a child, not that she could carry one. She had lied about several miscarriages, staged a hospital file, and even pretended to take fertility drugs. But the truth haunted her. She was barren, and the only child Damien ever longed for had been Amarachi's, a child now lost forever. At night, she would walk through the mansion barefoot, touching the furniture that once belonged to Amarachi. Sometimes she stood by the mirror and whispered, "You will never return." But she couldn't sleep. She had dreams where Amarachi's shadow stood by her bed, watching her silently, never blinking. Damien often woke up to her screams. "It's just stress," she'd say. But in truth, her guilt had started to rot from the inside. Her wealth grew, her reputation expanded, but peace eluded her. She began seeing a spiritualist, asking if the dead could return. "She's not dead," the woman had replied, peering into cowries. "But the one you stole from is close. And when truth comes, your crown will choke you." Ngozi left shaking. She increased security at the mansion and began watching every stranger twice. Because in her heart, she knew something was coming, and it had the face of the past. In the heart of Ajaganal, where the gutters overflowed and children chased tires through flooded streets, 17-year-old Chisholm lived a life carved from survival. She wasn't the kind of girl people noticed, slim, dark-skinned, always barefoot, with eyes far older than her age. She had been raised in a government-run orphanage until age 12, after which she was tossed into foster care. Her last foster mother died during a robbery, and since then, she had fended for herself. By day, she sold bread and sachet water at the motor park. By night, she swept compound yards in exchange for a wooden bench to sleep on. She didn't complain. Life had never given her a choice. But what set Chisholm apart was her quiet fire. She read newspapers from the dustbins she cleaned. She asked drivers questions about court, about justice. She wanted to be a lawyer. "So I can fight for those who don't have people," she told herself. Though she didn't know it, her mother had whispered the same thing once behind prison bars. Each morning, she woke at 4:30 a.m., washed her tray with a torn sponge, picked up her loaves from the bakery, and began hawking before the first bus took off. She dodged abusive touts, escaped greedy area boys, and learned how to hide her earnings in her bra. Yet despite the hardship, Chisholm never hardened. She always gave an extra slice of bread to the madman at the corner. She tied rubber bands on the feet of beggar children so they could walk without cutting themselves. She never understood why. It just felt like the right thing. One rainy afternoon, while rushing to take shelter near the rail line, she saw a figure curled under a bridge, a frail, dark-skinned old woman with shaking hands, drenched to the bone. No one paid her any attention. She looked like another forgotten soul. But Chisholm stopped. Something about the woman made her heart pause. "Ma, take bread," she said, kneeling. The woman looked up, her eyes dull but deep, like someone who had seen too much. She accepted the bread but said nothing. Chisholm placed a sachet of water beside her, then stood and walked away. But she couldn't forget the woman's face. For reasons she couldn't explain, she returned the next day, and the next. She started saving a piece of bread just for her. "I call her Mama Rain," she told herself. The woman rarely spoke, but one day she looked into Chisholm's eyes and said, "You smell like mercy." Chisholm laughed. "I smell like sweat, Mama," she replied, not knowing that the woman she was feeding was the one who once sang lullabies into her unborn ears, the one whose tears fell into her tiny heart before she was taken away. Amarachi now lived near the refuse corner beside a broken drainage channel behind Mile 12 Market. Her skin, once smooth and radiant, was now blistered from sun exposure. Her hair had turned white at the roots, though she was only in her 40s. She didn't beg. She didn't speak unless necessary. Most people thought she was mad, a former madam who lost her mind. But every night, she arranged 3 bricks, placed her back against the wall, and prayed silently for Chisholm, her daughter, her heartbeat. She had no way of knowing where the girl was, no documents, no birthmark memories. But she had a stubborn belief that the child was alive, and that someday, somehow, she would see her again. The days passed slowly. Most people avoided her, but not the bread girl. Chisholm had become a daily presence in Amarachi's world, a quiet angel in slippers. She never asked questions. She just brought food, sometimes mangoes, sometimes puff-puff. Once she came with Panadol after seeing Amarachi holding her side. Another time, she returned with an old wrapper and helped Amarachi tie it properly around her waist. There was something healing in her presence. Amarachi began to hum softly again. Not words, just tunes, familiar lullabies that stirred memories long buried. One evening, as Chisholm sat beside her, eating quietly, Amarachi whispered, You remind me of someone I lost." Chisholm looked up. "Who?" she asked. Amarachi shook her head slowly. "I never got to meet her, but I carried her inside me. They took her away before I held her." Chisholm felt something tighten in her chest. "What was her name?" she asked gently. Amarachi paused. "Chisholm," she whispered. The world went quiet for a second. Chisholm smiled nervously. "That's my name," she said. Amarachi looked up slowly, her eyes trembling. She studied the girl's face, but time and poverty had stolen any clear memories of what her baby would look like. Still, something stirred. "Did you grow up in an orphanage?" Amarachi asked softly. Chisholm nodded. "I don't remember my parents. They said I was taken from a convict mother, but I don't know who she is." Amarachi blinked rapidly. Her heart raced. Her hands trembled. But she said nothing more. She couldn't. The pain was too raw. What if it was just a cruel coincidence? What if this wasn't her daughter? She didn't have the strength to hope. But that night, after Chisholm left, Amarachi cried into the cold floor. Not the hopeless cry of loss, but the terrifying sob of possibility. Could Mercy wear slippers and call her Mama Rain? The night was thick with humidity, and the breeze carried the scent of roasted corn, rain-soaked sand, and distant diesel fumes. Chisholm sat cross-legged beside the dumpster, as she often did now, quietly munching on boiled groundnuts, while Amarachi leaned against the concrete wall, coughing softly into her wrapper. The two had grown closer in silence, bonded not by words, but by something deeper, spiritual. On this particular night, something unusual stirred the air. After a long pause, Amarachi began to hum. It wasn't a song Chisholm had ever heard played on the radio or sung in church. No, it was something ancient, intimate. A lullaby. Its tune was slow, drawn out, filled with yearning. Chisholm paused mid-chew. Her eyes narrowed. That song. That exact tune. She didn't know how, but she had heard it before, not in memory, but in her bones. It wrapped around her like warmth in a cold room. She didn't say anything at first, but her heart raced as she turned to Amarachi. "Mama, where did you learn that song?" she asked, voice barely audible. Amarachi stopped humming, startled. She looked away, her face suddenly haunted. "It's nothing," she whispered. "Just an old tune from my past." But her fingers trembled. That lullaby was not one she had ever sung publicly. It was something she made up in prison, the only song she ever sang to her unborn daughter. Amarachi remembered humming it as she pressed her hands to her belly on the cold prison floor, promising her baby that she was not alone. She had hummed it so often, it became part of her breath. Now this girl, this bread seller, recognized it. It didn't make sense. Unless... Amarachi shook her head violently. She couldn't dare to believe. The pain of false hope was worse than death. Chisholm sat in silence, her chest tight. She stared ahead into the distance, but her mind drifted back to her dreams. Dreams she'd had since childhood of a woman's voice singing her to sleep. She had always dismissed it as imagination. But now the voice had a face. A broken, sunken, weather-worn face, and yet somehow still beautiful. Still sacred. The resemblance was too strong to ignore. The name. The lullaby. The warmth she felt. Could it be? She looked at Amarachi, who was now staring down at her fingers as if they were foreign. "Mama, do you remember what your baby looked like?" she asked. Amarachi smiled faintly, tears gathering in her eyes. "I never saw her," she replied. "They took her, before I could hold her." The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with echoes of years stolen, truths buried, and a question neither of them dared to voice out loud. 2 weeks later, Chisholm walked through the muddy streets of Balaga Market to pick up a box of day-old bread she'd been given on credit. Her mind was foggy with thoughts, Amarachi's lullaby, the pain in her eyes, the soft way she said Chisholm, like it meant more than a name. She couldn't shake it off. Something inside her had been unlocked. That night, as rain poured down in sheets, she took shelter beside a junk vendor's kiosk. A ramshackle stall stacked with torn textbooks, rusted locks, broken mugs, and water-damaged files. As she leaned on a stack of dusty papers, one fell open. Curiously, she picked it up. The first page was half-burnt but legible. The title read, The State versus Amarachi Okonkwo. Her heart stopped. She scanned further. Keywords leapt off the page. Accused of murder, minor victim. Pregnant at time of sentencing. Evidence circumstantial, defense weak. Her hands trembled violently. The vendor barked at her. What you day find? That one na expired paper. But Chisholm ignored him. She clutched the folder to her chest and ran through the rain, legs shaking. At home, she dried the pages beside a lantern and read every word by candlelight. It was all there. Amarachi's case file, photocopied during appeal processes and later discarded during an office relocation. She read the date of the child's death, the trial timeline, the name of the police chief whose son had died. It all lined up. Amarachi had told her the same things, but she thought they were random memories. She now realized they were confessions, half-buried truths. Chisholm felt sick to her stomach. She flipped to the evidence list. Item 3. A toy car with bloodstains, recovered from the accused vehicle by witness N.O. She whispered aloud. Ngozi Anyuha. That night, Chisholm couldn't sleep. Her entire body burned with questions. Who was this Ngozi? How could a best friend testify like that? Why was the evidence so shaky? No DNA tests, no CCTV, no motive. She reread the section about Amarachi's baby being taken away at birth due to the prison welfare policy. Her heart pounded. She fit every line. The timeline matched her own age. The name matched. Could it really be her? She needed more. This was no longer curiosity. This was destiny. The next day, she skipped her hawking rounds and traveled to the local magistrate's records office. She claimed she was doing a school project on wrongful convictions. The clerk, a tired old man with tireder eyes, grunted and pulled out a folder. You're wasting time, he said. That woman, she was guilty. Chisholm swallowed hard. Was she asked softly. Or was she destroyed? The clerk, Mr. Gambo, flicked ash from his cigarette as he tossed an old yellow file on the desk. This is all we got left. Rest were moved to the Federal Archive or lost. Chisholm opened it with careful fingers. Inside were press clippings, grainy photos from court, and a witness statement that chilled her. It was written in hurried ink, signed by Ngozi Anyuha, and claimed she had found the blood-stained toy in Amarachi's bag. The lines felt rehearsed. There were contradictions. The time of discovery didn't match the earlier statement about when Amarachi and Ngozi left the orphanage. As she read deeper, she noticed something odd. The handwriting in the witness report was suspiciously similar to another unrelated statement, one made by a supposed neighbor. Two voices. One pen. Chisholm looked up at Mr. Gambo. Did anyone ever question a friend's role? She asked. He chuckled. Who go question rich people friend? Once Ogadamian dumped her, case close. Chisholm left the office with a heavy mind. She now believed Amarachi's innocence, not just emotionally, but logically. She had always felt connected to the woman, but now she felt responsible for her justice. Back at the bridge where Amarachi lived, Chisholm found her coughing badly and shaking from fever. She rushed to buy medicine and sat with her all night, placing a wet rag on her head. Mama, I need to ask you something, she said. This woman, Ngozi, was she your best friend? Amarachi didn't respond at first, but after a long silence, she nodded faintly. She stood in court and said you were guilty, Chisholm whispered. Amarachi's eyes closed tightly, a tear slipping down her cheek. She wanted my life, she murmured. And she took it. The days that followed were a blur of motion for Chisholm. She visited a local human rights group. She spoke to a retired female lawyer who used to work on wrongful conviction cases. She dug up more files, scanned them into her friend's borrowed phone. She had no training, no degree, but she had fire. Amarachi, still too broken to hope, watched her quietly. One day she said, Why are you doing this for me? Chisholm hesitated before answering. Because I think God wants me to. And because I think you might be my mother. Amarachi gasped softly, pressing a hand to her lips. What did you say? Chisholm pulled out the scorched file and held it in trembling hands. Mama, if you'll let me, I want to prove it. I want to prove everything. The two women sat in silence as the sun rose, one cradling a lifetime of loss, the other holding the pieces of truth like a flame that refused to die. The days that followed Chisholm's revelation to Amarachi felt like living in two worlds. On one side was the unforgiving reality of the present, hunger, sickness, and a society that still believed Amarachi was a murderer. On the other was the growing storm of the past, a storm Chisholm refused to let die. Every night, she pieced together timelines on a sheet of torn cardboard, using charcoal to draw lines connecting names, dates, and accusations. One evening, she returned with a black and white photograph she had retrieved from a local newspaper archive, a photo of Amarachi from the day of her conviction. In it, Amarachi's face was gaunt but defiant, her belly swollen with the pregnancy no one cared about. Chisholm held the photo beside her own reflection in a plastic mirror. The resemblance hit her like thunder. Same forehead, same lips, same curved ears. She felt dizzy. It's not just a feeling anymore, she whispered to herself. It's truth. Amarachi, though hesitant, began to speak more. Late at night, she shared stories from her life before prison. Your father, he was everything to me once, she said. But when the trial began, he couldn't look at me. He believed Ngozi. Everyone did. Chisholm listened intently, every word solidifying the puzzle. The name of the police chief, Inspector Ajayi, matched the file. The toy car with blood. The scarf that wasn't hers. Amarachi recalled how she had left her car keys with Ngozi the day before the child died. That was when Ngozi must have planted the toy. She hugged me before court, Amarachi whispered, voice cracking. She told me to be strong, while she was holding the knife behind my back. Chisholm could see the hurt wasn't just from betrayal. It was from the shame of knowing the entire world turned against an innocent woman while her best friend wore her perfume and smiled into cameras. But Chisholm wasn't ready to stop at just stories. She had one more mission, to prove she was Amarachi's daughter, not just in theory, but by law. One of the street nurses who occasionally treated injured area boys owed Chisholm a favor. She convinced her to take a hair sample from Amarachi and from herself. This test, it might take time, the nurse warned. But I'll get it done. Quietly. Chisholm nodded. As they waited, she continued her investigation, collecting clips, blog posts, court sketches. Every thread pointed to Ngozi. Every knot was tied by a woman who had stolen a life and buried it under power and makeup. One night, while watching Amarachi sleep, Chisholm whispered, when the truth comes, it won't just clear your name. It will burn everything she built. In that moment, her purpose shifted. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about restoration, giving a woman her name, her child, and her voice back. It was a cloudy Monday morning when Chisholm received a folded brown envelope from the nurse. No label, no stamps, just a piece of truth wrapped in quiet paper. She opened it with trembling fingers, her heart in her throat. The results were clear. A 99.98% DNA match. Amarachi was her biological mother. Chisholm fell to her knees, shaking, overwhelmed by a flood of grief and joy that tore through her chest. All the questions of her life, her dreams, her scars, her name, finally made sense. She had lived her entire life thinking she was nobody. Now, she knew her blood came from a woman who had survived hell. That evening, she returned to Amarachi in tears and simply placed the paper in her hand. Amarachi stared at it for a long time, her fingers tracing the letters like Braille. Then, quietly, she collapsed into Chisholm's arms, sobbing like a mother holding her child for the very first time. But their quiet reunion didn't go unnoticed. Someone had been watching Chisholm. One of the thugs who loitered near the old court building noticed her frequent visits, her questions, her file hunting. He was on Ngozi's payroll. That same night, as Chisholm was returning home, two men followed her into a narrow alley and pinned her against the wall. You asked too many questions, one hissed, holding a broken bottle to her throat. Madam say make you stop or disappear. Chisholm, though terrified, didn't cry. She stared at them with fire in her eyes. Tell Madam she should be afraid. The truth is out. One of the men slapped her hard and dropped her to the ground before disappearing into the night. Chisholm limped home, her lip bleeding, but her soul burning brighter than ever. If Ngozi thought she could scare her into silence, she didn't know the kind of daughter Amarachi had raised, even without knowing it. Amarachi was horrified when she saw Chisholm's bruised face. "We should stop," she whispered. "I don't want them to hurt you." But Chisholm shook her head. "Mama, they already took everything from you. If we stop now, we bury the truth forever." That night, the two of them began preparing their statement. Chisholm used the file, the DNA results, and the evidence of forgery in Ngozi's statement to draft a petition. They had no lawyer, no money, no powerful name to back them, but they had the truth. Chisholm submitted the petition to a local human rights legal aid clinic. The director, a tough woman named Barrister Aloho, was skeptical at first, until she read the file. "This case stinks of conspiracy," she said, "and I don't like the smell of rich people who bury the poor." She took the case. A retrial was set. Amarachi's name would be heard in court again, not as a murderer, but as a woman seeking justice. Damien Okonkwo sat in his office at the top of a 20-story building overlooking the Lagos skyline, sipping whiskey at 11 a.m. It was a habit he had developed over the past few years. Though the world still saw a billionaire, he felt like a fraud. The joy he once had in business, in love, in life, it was gone. And though he had convinced himself that Amarachi was guilty, a seed of doubt had been growing in him. A month ago, he saw a blurry photo of a street girl shared on a blog. It was taken during a human rights rally. In the background, hidden behind the crowd, was a gaunt, familiar face. Amarachi. He had stared at the image for days. He told himself it wasn't her. But the eyes, God, the eyes. He couldn't ignore them. They haunted him like unfinished prayers. He had ordered his assistant to delete the photo, but instead, he printed it and kept it in his drawer. That week, he drove through Ojuelegba in disguise, something he hadn't done in decades. The dust, the heat, the stares. He hated it. But something in him, a deep guilt, a shame he had buried, was calling him to truth. At a bus stop, he saw her. Not Amarachi, but someone who looked like a younger version of her. The girl was handing out flyers about a retrial. Her eyes met his for a moment. Damien froze. His heart stopped. That face. It was Amarachi's face, but younger, slimmer. His chest tightened. He didn't approach her. He simply watched from the car, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He returned home and confronted Ngozi. "Did you ever lie to me?" he asked. She laughed. "About what, darling?" But he wasn't laughing. "About Amarachi. About the trial. Did you ever lie?" Ngozi's eyes flashed. "After all these years, you're asking me that? Are you losing your mind?" Damien didn't respond. But the seed had cracked open. Late that night, Damien called his private investigator, the same one he used to track company leaks. "I need everything on a girl named Chisholm. Sells bread. Might be tied to a retrial. Get me everything." He hung up and stared out the window. The city sparkled beneath him, but none of it brought peace. He thought of the way Amarachi used to laugh, how she folded towels into flowers, how she whispered scriptures before bed. He had burned all of it away without asking one question. Now, pieces of that past were crawling back. If the girl really was his daughter, if Amarachi was really innocent, then he wasn't just a broken man. He was a betrayer. And no amount of wealth could ever buy him forgiveness for the kind of silence he had chosen. The day the court announced the approval of Amarachi's retrial, the wind in Lagos felt different, not lighter, but heavier, as if the city itself knew that a buried secret was about to rise. The news came through a small broadcast on a local human rights radio show. Former death row inmate to be retried after 17 years in landmark appeal led by orphan girl. Chisholm stood frozen in the market when she heard the words. Customers moved around her, yelling prices, carrying tomatoes. But her soul detached from the noise. It was real. The judiciary had finally accepted that Amarachi's case deserved a second look. It wasn't a full exoneration, not yet, but it was enough to force the court to re-examine the faulty evidence, the suspicious testimony, and the suspiciously missing witnesses. The legal aid team, led by Barrister Aloho, moved swiftly. Files were dusted off. Summons were issued. Amarachi, for the first time in 17 years, would return to court, not as a criminal, but as a woman demanding truth. The reaction from the other side was fast and ruthless. Ngozi, when she heard the news, threw her wine glass across her bedroom and screamed until her throat went dry. Who approved that trial? Who reopened that cursed case? She yelled at her political contacts. She made dozens of calls, pulling on every string she had tied over the years, threatening judges, promising bribes, even contacting Inspector Ajayi, now retired and living quietly in Enugu. But times had changed. The man was old now, and guilt had eaten at him for years. When the summons arrived, he didn't fight it. He simply packed a faded uniform into his bag, took his blood pressure medicine, and boarded a night bus to Lagos. Damien, on the other hand, received the news with a silence that echoed louder than any shout. He sat in his office, staring at the summons he had received not as a defendant, but as a potential witness. For the first time in years, he began to replay the past, not from the angle of betrayal, but from the angle of his own cowardice. In the days leading up to the trial, Amarachi remained calm, but her hands shook whenever she touched the court documents. She hadn't stepped inside a courtroom since the day she was sentenced to death. That memory was still raw, the echo of the gavel, the smug look on Ngozi's face, the shame in Damien's eyes. Now she was returning not in handcuffs, but with her daughter by her side. Chisholm had bought her a simple black gown from the second-hand market and polished black flats that barely fit. She also wrapped a scarf around her mother's head, hiding her white hair, but not the dignity in her face. "Whatever happens in there," Chisholm whispered, "you will not bow your head again. You are not a convict. You are a queen who was robbed." Amarachi smiled weakly, tears rising. "And you," she said softly, "are the child I prayed for behind iron bars. You are the proof that God still hears." The courtroom was packed by 9 a.m. journalists, legal scholars, activists, and even university law students crammed into the wooden pews, whispering about the return of the woman once dubbed Lagos' murdered queen. The judge was a younger woman this time, Justice Amina Yusuf, known for her no-nonsense reputation and integrity. She entered the courtroom with firm steps and didn't bother with pleasantries. "We are here to reconsider the matter of the state versus Amarachi Okonkwo, based on the emergence of new evidence and possible miscarriage of justice," she said flatly. All eyes turned to Amarachi as she entered the courtroom. She walked slowly, each step steady, her frail frame draped in black, but her back unbent. The room fell silent. Damien sat in the back row, disguised in a low cap, his eyes locked on her. He hadn't seen her in nearly 2 decades. His heart clenched when he saw how much she had aged, how sorrow had carved lines into her once youthful face. She didn't even glance in his direction. Ngozi entered 5 minutes later in a red lace gown and oversized sunglasses, flanked by 2 lawyers. Her face was plastered with indifference, but her hands kept shaking. She recognized Chisholm immediately. Her lips parted. The girl looked like a ghost she had tried to bury, a younger Amarachi with sharper fire. As she took her seat, Chisholm turned and met her eyes with cold intensity. There was no fear in her gaze, only justice. The case began with the human rights lawyer, Barrister Aloho, presenting the motion for retrial. She laid out the inconsistencies in the original trial, the lack of DNA evidence, the convenient disappearance of key witnesses, the planted toy car retrieved by someone with access to Amarachi's vehicle, Ngozi. Then came the bombshell, the DNA test linking Chisholm to Amarachi, confirming that the baby Amarachi was pregnant with during her sentencing not only survived, but was now standing before the court. Gasps filled the courtroom. Damien leaned forward, stunned. His eyes locked onto Chisholm. "My God," he whispered. "She's mine." He couldn't breathe. Flashbacks flooded his mind. The day Amarachi tried to tell him something before the arrest, the way she held her belly in court, the months she spent in silence before her sentencing. He had never asked what happened to the baby. He had assumed the child died. But here she was, alive, bold, fighting. His child. The realization hit like a tidal wave. Meanwhile, the retired Inspector Ajayi was called to the stand. He looked frail, but his voice was steady. He confessed that the investigation had been rushed. There was pressure to close the case quickly, he said. Ngozi was the one who pushed the narrative. I never double-checked her statement. I regret it. The silence in the room was thick with disbelief. Justice Yusuf narrowed her eyes. And why are you only coming forward now? She asked. The old man's eyes filled with tears. Because I've been watching my daughter grow up. And if someone had done to her what we did to this woman, I would burn down the system myself. The courtroom was electric, as Justice Yusuf called for a short recess. Reporters rushed out to send updates. Cameras flashed outside. Inside, Damien rose from his seat, heart thudding. He walked slowly to the front where Amarachi stood by the legal bench with Chisholm beside her. He removed his cap. Amarachi saw him. Time stopped. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. His lips parted, but no words came out. Her eyes, though aged, held steady. You came, she whispered. Damien fell to his knees. Right there, in front of everyone. The billionaire who once turned his back now trembled like a boy. I didn't know, he said, voice cracking. I didn't know you were innocent. I didn't know about the baby. I failed you. I failed both of you. Tears streamed down his face. Chisholm looked at him. This man who had lived in her blood but never in her life, and felt a strange, hollow ache. Amarachi didn't speak. She simply nodded and touched his shoulder, not in forgiveness, but in closure. What's done is done, she whispered. But you will not silence me again. Damien bowed his head. It wasn't absolution. It was judgment wrapped in grace. Court resumed 30 minutes later. Chisholm was called to testify. She walked up to the witness stand with her head high, holding her mother's case file. I was raised in the slums, she said. I never knew my parents. I never knew who I was. But the first time I saw her, something in me came alive. I didn't know I was feeding my own mother, but my spirit knew. Blood knows blood. And when I found out the truth, I decided I wouldn't let her story end in lies. She held up the DNA result. This is proof. Not just that she's my mother, but that truth doesn't die. It waits. And today it stands. The judge was silent for a long time after Chisholm's testimony. She flipped through the documents, tapped her pen against her chin, and then finally looked up. It is the opinion of this court that the original conviction was based on flawed investigation, perjured testimony, and fabricated evidence. In light of new findings, the court hereby nullifies the conviction of Mrs. Amarachi Okonkwo and declares her innocent of all charges. The room erupted. Reporters screamed. Activists applauded. Damien wept. Ngozi stood frozen, her face drained of color. Amarachi closed her eyes. Chisholm grabbed her hand. The chains had finally broken. The court was no longer a place of shame. It was a place of resurrection. Outside, the sky that had once rained on a convicted woman now opened with light. Amarachi Okonkwo walked out of the courthouse as a free woman. And for the first time in 17 years, her daughter walked beside her, no longer feeding a stranger, but holding her mother's hand in victory. Ngozi tried to walk out of the courtroom with her head high, but the cameras didn't follow her like they used to. They chased Amarachi now. The reporters shoved microphones in her face, not Ngozi's. The crowd that once called her Madame Ngozi, savior of women, now looked at her with eyes sharpened by truth. Her steps became uneven. Her hands trembled. She tried to summon her driver with a wave of her phone, but no one came. Her carefully painted mask began to melt under the weight of public disgrace. As she reached the court's outer gate, a plainclothes officer stepped in front of her. Mrs. Ngozi Anyuha, you are under arrest for conspiracy to pervert justice, perjury, and criminal obstruction of a murder investigation. You have the right to remain silent. She laughed, a thin, nervous laugh, thinking it was a joke. Me? Arrested? I'm the one who stood by during the storm. I gave press conferences. I ran a foundation. But her voice cracked under its own hypocrisy. A female officer stepped forward and clipped cuffs onto her wrists. The click echoed like thunder. The press, ever hungry, turned their cameras back toward her. She screamed, struggled, tried to reach Damien in the crowd. Damien, Damien, tell them this is a mistake. But he didn't look at her. He stood beside Amarachi and Chisholm now, no longer a puppet. As the police led her toward the van, people threw empty sachets and cursed. Witch. Backstabber. How many more lives did you ruin? She covered her face, but it was too late. Her carefully crafted image shattered like glass beneath a judge's gavel. Inside the police van, Ngozi sat in silence, her wig slipping off her scalp. She stared out the window as they drove past a large banner that read, "Justice for Amarachi." Her lips trembled. She had everything, the house, the man, the fame. And yet, she lost it all to one truth she could not kill. Blood speaks. Lies may last long, but they never outlive truth. In her prison cell, far from the golden sheets of the Okonkwo mansion, she would come to understand what Amarachi endured, but without innocence, without love, and without redemption. And Amarachi? She would sleep in peace, because justice had done what time and pain could not. It had returned her voice. The sun bathed the courthouse steps in a golden light as Amarachi stood outside, blinking slowly, not because of the brightness, but because she could hardly believe she was seeing the world again with her name restored. She wasn't Mrs. Murderer anymore. She was Amarachi Okonkwo. Her name no longer sat on court files like a stain. It now stood as a banner of survival. She inhaled deeply, as though tasting freedom for the first time. Chisholm held her hand tightly. Around them, activists applauded. People took photos. Some cried openly. Others whispered, "That's the woman who was innocent." Amarachi turned to her daughter, her lips trembling. "You saved me," she whispered. "No," Chisholm replied. "You saved me first. I only found my way back to you." Damien approached quietly, his eyes swollen from tears, his voice unsure. "Amara, I failed you." She didn't let him finish. She raised a hand gently, then said, "You believed a lie, and you left me in the fire." He lowered his head. "I know, and I will never stop making amends. Not with words, with action. Starting with our daughter." Chisholm stepped forward. For the first time, she allowed herself to look at her father without pain. She studied him. "You're late," she said plainly. "But I'm not a bitter woman." She extended her hand. He took it. "We will rebuild," she added. "But slowly. You'll earn it." He nodded, humbled. "Anything it takes." Together, they walked to the car Damien had parked far from a crowd. A newer SUV followed behind, a gift for Amarachi. She declined it. "I'll start with a rented room. I want to walk again from scratch. My way." And Damien understood. She didn't want to be saved. She wanted to rise. 3 months later, Amarachi and Chisholm stood in front of a building painted in soft cream and green. The sign read, "The Chisholm Legal Aid and Mother's Justice Center." It was a new legal clinic funded by donations, run by the same people who helped her regain her freedom. Chisholm was now enrolled in school with a full scholarship. Damien had placed a trust fund in her name, but left it untouched until she asked for it. Amarachi worked there as a counselor, not as a victim, but as a mentor to women falsely accused or forgotten. One afternoon, as they packed files at closing time, a mother walked in, tears in her eyes, begging for help. Amarachi smiled, held her hand, and said, "Sit down. We believe you." In the corner of the room was a framed photo of Amarachi and Chisholm, not during the trial, but on the day of their first embrace, under the bridge where a girl gave bread to a stranger. At the bottom, one line was written in bold. "Blood speaks. Truth returns. Mercy wears slippers." Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tochi Stories for more.